If you were tuning a shortwave radio back in the late 70s or 80s, you eventually ran into this incredibly annoying sound. It wasn't static, and it wasn't a normal broadcast. It just sounded like a sharp, repetitive tapping, about 10 times a second, like a pencil hitting a desk right next to a microphone. People called it the Russian woodpecker because of how it sounded, and it would just take over entire frequencies, wiping out commercial aviation communications, shipping lines, and amateur radio operators all over the world. The strange thing is, most people at the time thought this was some kind of top-secret Soviet mind control experiment, or an attempt to mess with the weather in the West, because the signal was just so massive and completely unauthorized. I actually remember looking through some old amateur radio forums from years ago, where guys who were active back then talked about how much they hated this thing. They would try to build special filters just to block out the tapping so they could actually use their equipment. But the real story behind it isn't some sci-fi mind control plot, and it's actually a lot more practical, which in a way makes it even creepier when you see what was actually causing it. The sound was coming from a pair of massive, hidden radar stations inside the Soviet Union, with the main one built deep in the forests near Chernobyl. If you look at photos of the place today, it looks like a giant, rusty metal wall rising straight out of the trees. It's absolutely massive, nearly 500 feet high and almost half a mile long. They called it Duga, and it was an over-the-horizon radar system. The Soviets built it because they were terrified of a surprise nuclear strike from the US, and standard radar couldn't see past the curvature of the Earth. By bouncing massive radio waves off the ionosphere, they could basically peek over the horizon and spot the exhaust plumes of missiles lifting off from launch pads thousands of miles away. The thing is, keeping a system like that running required an absurd amount of power, which is exactly why they put it right next to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It needed its own dedicated town called Chernobyl 2, which didn't even appear on official maps at the time. Thousands of military personnel and their families lived there in total secrecy, operating this giant ear that was constantly listening to the sky. But the system had a major flaw that the Soviet engineers didn't really account for when they first started broadcasting. The signal was so incredibly powerful that it didn't just look for missiles, it actively disrupted civilian life across the globe. It interfered with everything from transatlantic flight coordination to local emergency broadcasts in Europe. It got so bad that television and radio manufacturers in the West actually had to start building specific circuits into their electronics called Woodpecker blankers just to filter out the noise so people could watch TV without a constant buzzing in the background. Governments in the US, Canada, and the UK filed thousands of official complaints with the Soviet Union, but the Soviets just denied everything. They even claimed it was just a civilian tracking system or an atmospheric test, even though everyone with a directional antenna could trace the signal right back to Ukraine and Siberia. And then, in the late 1980s, the sound just stopped. Most people assumed it was because the Cold War was winding down, or because satellite technology had finally gotten good enough that the Soviets didn't need this giant, clumsy metal grid anymore. But the actual timeline links up perfectly with the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. When the reactor exploded, the entire area became heavily contaminated with radiation, including the secret town of Chernobyl 2. They had to shut down the radar operations and evacuate the staff because it just wasn't safe to live or work there anymore. The highly advanced, incredibly expensive computers inside the facility were left behind to rot, covered in radioactive dust. Today, the Duga radar just sits there in the exclusion zone, slowly rusting away. It's one of those places that urban explorers love to photograph because it looks like a monument to a completely different era of technology. It never actually worked the way the Soviets wanted it to either. It was plagued by interference from the Northern Lights and constantly threw false positives, meaning millions of rubles were spent on a giant metal wall that mostly just succeeded in annoying radio listeners across the globe for a decade.